A new report from The Athletic sheds light on the previously mysterious fifth team on Nolan Arenado's trade list, and in the process, vindicates John Mozeliak. What's going on, everyone, and welcome in to this edition of b-schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer with you. It's Friday night, February 21st, 2025, as I record this. Today was the final day at Cardinals camp before the Grapefruit League play begins, so make sure to check out the other recent videos on the YouTube channel, because I posted two of them from Friday's camp day, some batting practice with some of the main names on the team, as well as a Michael McGreevy live batting practice session in which Jimmy Crooks made his mark. You're going to want to go and check out that video, as well as some of the defensive drills from earlier in the day. Cardinal infielders working on double plays, as well as some rundown drills after pickoff attempts. So some good stuff there. And kind of a close call. If you want to watch that video for one Mason win, you'll know it when you see it. That's all I'm going to say. But I'm not going to talk very much about the camp day in this episode of the show, because there was a pretty interesting new report that came out on Friday morning by Katie Woo of The Athletic, which delved into pretty much depth on the Nolan Arenado trade situation, the one that, didn't ultimately come to fruition between the Cardinals and Arenado, and one of the five teams on his reported list this offseason. He's in camp. I think he's going to be with the team for the bulk of the season. We'll see whether the trade deadline comes around and the Cardinals, maybe if they're out of the race by then, the trade talks kick back up. But otherwise, I feel like things are at a stall, and you can pretty well expect Arenado to be around. At first, I was kind of wondering, after Alex Bregman signed with the Boston Red Sox, could there be a reawakening of conversations potentially with a team like the Yankees? I still kind of thought, hey, you know what? The Dodgers could come swooping in at the last minute. Money is really of no object to them, of course, and maybe they end up deciding that a guy like Arenado could put them over the top as they seek their second consecutive World Series championship. But that hasn't happened to this point, and by now, I really just don't expect it to. However, we did get some information that I thought was worth talking about in Katie's report, as she gave a lot of background on the entire offseason saga, how close Arenado was to potentially being traded not once, but maybe a couple of times. And one of them we knew about. The other one was kind of reported late in the stage as it pertains to the Red Sox. They preferred Bregman. That was the case all along, and Katie's report on Friday mentioned it. And ultimately, they got Bregman, which left Arenado without a chair, basically, not one that was outside of the Jupiter clubhouse for the St. Louis Cardinals, of course. So he's still with the Cardinals. But whatever happened with that Houston Astros trade, the one that was blocked by Arenado earlier in the winter, John Mozeliak, if you remember back to the winter meetings, was so confident at the time that a deal would ultimately get done that he was basically talking about it. He's usually pretty tight-lipped, but was saying more than he normally would during those winter meetings and the reports that came out from that. So it makes you wonder, why did the Cardinals feel such confidence that Arenado would accept a trade to the Houston Astros when ultimately that was the team that Mozeliak had an agreement in place with, and when it came time for Arenado to push the deal through, he balked and didn't do it. Why did that happen? We could speculate at the time, and we did, that, well, maybe the trade of Kyle Tucker to the Chicago Cubs earlier that week had something to do with it. Perhaps John Mozeliak was of the belief that, even if the Astros aren't necessarily on Arenado's list, there was presumably some conversations that happened that had Mozeliak believing that if they got something across the finish line with the Astros, that Arenado would accept it. Well, now I feel like we have all the confirmation that we need of that with Katie's report, because for the longest time, and although there had been a number of reports out there, none of them seemed to be super certain who that fifth team was, right? We knew the Dodgers, we knew the Yankees, we knew the Red Sox, and we knew the Padres. Those were kind of generally accepted, consistent across all the different people who had dipped their toe out and reported on what was going on here. The fifth team, according to Katie, and you should definitely check out her story in The Athletic. I will link to it in the video description so you get all the context. But that fifth team, per Katie Woo, was the Houston Astros. That's right. A team that Arenado had on his list, and it was an acceptable trade destination, and the Cardinals negotiated a deal with the Astros, got one to the finish line, said, hey, Nolan, sign off on this, and we're good to go. And he didn't do it. It wasn't that John Mozeliak went to a team outside of Arenado's approved list. No, Houston was the fifth team. which I kind of had wondered about, but we figured that couldn't be the case at some point in time as we thought through this offseason because, of course, ultimately it was denied by Nolan Arenado. So hearing it confirmed or seeing it confirmed that it was, in fact, the Astros that were on that list, oh, that changes some things, doesn't it, about the way that this all went down. Great article by Katie Wu. Definitely recommend you checking it out. But some of the highlights, in my opinion, in many ways vindicate John Mozeliak for his, for lack of a better phrase, failure to get priority 1, 2, and 3 across the finish line for the Cardinals this offseason. Those were his words that he used as recently as late January at the winter warmup. That was kind of mid to late January. And so that was long after the Knicks-Houston Astros trade from earlier in December. But that being said, the Cardinals maybe at that point felt like the Boston Red Sox would still be a possibility, and they were waiting on the Bregman thing, and ultimately Bregman signed there, which, whether we knew it at the time or not, it's since been revealed, pretty much put the Knicks on any opportunity the Cardinals would have had to move Nolan, at least at this point in time, because he's not expanding his list, and the Cardinals have pretty much exhausted all the options. The teams like the Dodgers and the Yankees weren't interested to the level that would have been necessary to even get into deeper conversations about the player. According to Katie, other teams like the Royals, the Tigers, and the Mariners checked in throughout points in the offseason, but Arenado didn't want to expand the list, so really there was not a lot of point in pursuing those possibilities. When it all comes down to it, the way that it's framed in Katie's article, and I'll continue to repeat that you should read it so you get all the context, but essentially, the Kyle Tucker trade did put Arenado in a spot where he had probably similar questions as to the questions he has or had about the Cardinals and their willingness and desire to compete for a championship right here, right now, and sell out to do it, win at all costs, right? We know the Cardinals aren't in that spot. They might have a pretty good team this year. Time's going to tell on that, but we know that they're doing some other things that are the priority, building up the infrastructure of the minor leagues, hiring new coaches, hiring new staff to be able to facilitate their goals for the long-range future. It's not just about 2025. So if you're a player who is growing increasingly desperate to win a championship because you've got a few years left on your contract, you're getting up there in age a little bit into your early to mid-30s, as Arenado is, he wants to win now. Cardinals aren't in that spot, but I think there was a moment where he wondered if the Astros were in that spot. And, maybe it's still a question. I feel like they've made some moves this offseason. They went out and signed Christian Walker. That was their pivot move after Arenado basically said, thanks, but no thanks. At least not right now. I'm not willing to waive the no-trade clause. And it's very interesting in Katie's article, as it is described. He informed Mozeliak that he would not waive his full no-trade clause to join Houston, at least not in the current time. He would be open to conversations later in the offseason, reading from Katie's article here, when more certainty about the Astros roster and his own market had been established. But Arenado also understood that Houston could pivot, which would essentially end chances of further negotiations later in the winter. Of course, that's exactly what happened, and it did not take the Astros long. Later that week, they ended up signing Christian Walker to a pretty similar deal, 3 years, $60 million, to the amount that Arenado was going to be due from Houston in the trade. The Cardinals were going to eat about $15 million. The Astros were going to eat 55, 56 or so, whatever that number ended up being. And so they ended up signing Christian Walker to an almost identical contract. They'll move the guy that they were going to have play first base to third, and Walker can play first, and they're out on Arenado. That's the way it went down because Arenado basically, when he had the opportunity, hesitated. Very interesting to see this all play out. And it was indeed the Kyle Tucker situation, I think, that spurred it because Mozeliak just didn't believe it was going to be an issue to get Arenado to agree to the deal, right? And that's why I'm sure there had to be some frustration from John Mozeliak. And Katie describes in the article that Mo was frustrated. Arenado probably frustrated. But basically, I think, and we tried to speculate on this throughout the offseason as to how desperate was Arenado to get out of St. Louis. Clearly not totally to the extent that it just had to happen at all costs. And he's since talked about when he got here at camp last week that he's got a family now. He's got a wife. He's got a young child. And to uproot the family, not necessarily going to just do it for any opportunity. It has to be the right fit. which is totally understandable. But it's kind of wild that Houston was evidently on the list of 5, and they're making moves to presumably facilitate the Arenado deal, right? They've got whatever financial restrictions they have. Kyle Tucker was due a pretty big raise in arbitration, and they didn't feel they could sign him long-term, and so they move him, get the pieces that they need to make the roster work, and then they were going to go after Arenado. Cardinals thought they had a done deal, but I think of the 5 teams, and clearly it probably played out this way, of the 5 teams that Arenado was willing to go to, Houston seemingly was number 5 on that list. And after they had the agreement in place, he wasn't ready to approve the deal. Mozeliak gave him the weekend to decide, it's reported by Katie in this article. And by Monday, he was still not sold. Didn't want to rule the Astros out for good, but wanted more time to see how his market would play out and how Alex Bregman's free agency was impacting it. But then, as we know, Bregman ended up taking a lot longer to ultimately end up signing. And so that pretty much ended the opportunity for Arenado's wares to be shopped elsewhere, because it took all the way up until basically spring training before Bregman ended up signing. And there was just no time. Everybody else had moved on. And as Arenado said when he got here, he doesn't really have an interest in expanding his list anyway. So how do we feel about this, Cardinals fans? Because when I look at it, there is not a lot more I think John Mozeliak could have done. That was kind of my sense throughout the process, that I know it's not popular to give Mo credit or to not give him criticism for something. It was a mistake. Here's where he made a mistake a couple of times. Talking about it was the mistake. The extent to which he talked about it. After the Houston thing happened, that was earlier in the offseason. And yet, about a month later, at the Cardinals winter warm-up, he still said priority 1, 2, and 3 was trading Arenado. So, at that point, there couldn't have been a ton of confidence that a deal was going to get done. Maybe they thought the Red Sox thing would work out at that point in time. And he was telling the truth. Like, that was their top priority. But some of the optics of that then come back on you because of the fact that he wasn't able to get the deal done. Again, I think a lot of this was not John Mozeliak's fault. But when you go out and say, hey, we're going to really put ourselves out there by telling everybody, letting the world know this is our only priority this offseason, when you don't do it, even if it's not a deal that fans wanted, like if Cardinals fans wanted Arenado to be here because they think he's pretty good, makes the team better, Cardinals fans can still look at that and say, well, John Mozeliak, this is not a competent usage of your time this offseason because you didn't get the thing done that you said was the only thing you were trying to get done. So that kind of gives some credence, as certain fans would ask, well, why can't Chaim Bloom just take over right now? You know, and look, I have said I think it makes sense that the Cardinals are giving Chaim Bloom all the time he needs to work on the infrastructure, to get that thing up and running, because what he didn't have with Boston was time. And even though now the Boston front office is benefiting from a lot of the infrastructure that was built by Chaim Bloom on the fly, their farm system is ranked very highly in the game. Those prospects are all on the verge of graduating. They've got their own problems in Boston with managing the veteran egos versus should they, give opportunities to some of those prospects who are knocking on the door. That's a different matter. The talent acquisition, I think, is hard to argue against for what Boston did, but they didn't win enough in the time frame that Chaim Bloom was there, and so they ended up letting him go. I think the Cardinals are setting up a scenario where patience is going to be a virtue, and this will be the second season of Chaim Bloom having his fingerprints on the organization, but not having to worry about or deal with the day-to-day of handling all of the roster from the very top down. I think he's got influence, but he doesn't have to be the final decision on a lot of these things, which in theory will free him up to be able to get the farm system and the state and the foundation of the organization where it needs to be. So as much as I do think this offseason might have played differently if it was just Chaim Bloom in charge, I also think having John Mozeliak have this final year, having the ability to send him out on those terms is something that's valuable to ownership. It's something that I'm sure is appreciated by John Mozeliak. Is it a little bit questionable, a little bit awkward, simply because of the fact that, it doesn't feel like the Cardinals have been able to hit home on that direction and that clarity that they have preached throughout the offseason and ever since the end of season press conference as to how they're going to proceed into 2025. Yeah, that's fair, because again, the Arenado thing was a pretty significant piece of that, and it wasn't accomplished. But again, it might have been ill-fated from the start, because if the Cardinals had got this deal done, I'm telling you, it would have been a salary dump. They wouldn't have been getting prospects back that you're excited about. I just refuse to believe that, because everybody knew of the leverage that the Cardinals didn't have, because they're just trying to drop the money and open up a spot internally for players on their roster to have third base and run with it. So really, the Cardinals didn't need to care about the prospects they were getting back, but from a fan base perspective, I don't really think Cardinals fans would have benefited from that. So as much as it's easy to criticize and say John Mozeliak had one goal, he said it out loud multiple times, and in mid-December, early to mid-December at the winter meetings, he made it really sound like he was going to accomplish this goal. I think that was the main thing that if you're John Mozeliak, you regret, because some of the tangible stuff, there's really not a lot he could have done. And it kind of makes sense that, as Katie writes in her article, there wasn't a lot of communication with Arenado and Mozeliak immediately following, in those weeks following the Houston deal blowing up, because what is there to say at this point? I'm John Mozeliak. I did everything that you asked me to do. I sent you to a team that was on your list, and you said, could you maybe get one of those other teams I preferred? Like, that was mismanaged. That was a botched handling of it if Arenado wanted to be somewhere else. But that's why he's got the no trade clause and can do what he wants with it. So I understand John Mozeliak being frustrated by the outcome of that for sure. And again, I think it's a little bit unfair the extent to which he's going to and has gotten blamed for it. Now understanding that, nope, this was a team that was literally on Arenado's list. If he didn't want to go there, he didn't have to put him on the list. It was a ballpark that I think he would have thrived in. All of the reasons that it made sense to have the Astros there. But you know what? If he was concerned about the direction and didn't want to basically uproot his family for a lateral move from an organization that's not solely focused on winning to an organization that he's not so sure what the next 2 to 3 years look like, then that's all fine and good. That is the contract at work. That is the no trade clause. That's the reason you have it, and it's perfectly within his rights to do it. I don't think he has a leg to stand on in terms of being frustrated, though. They described that he was frustrated with the way that it played out. Be frustrated, but there's not really a whole lot John Mozeliak could have done. If the Dodgers didn't want him, if the Yankees didn't want him, if the Red Sox wanted Bregman more, and the Padres had Machado, and so they just weren't really barking up that tree as an organization, also dealing with the ownership scramble that's going on in San Diego, that was the list. It wasn't a list that was very conducive to having a deal done, especially if Houston was one of the teams on that list, and then when the deal came together, said, can we get anything better? In retrospect, it's not surprising at all that it all unfolded this way, because I just don't think that was a list that was going to get Arenado very far when you look at it in retrospect, unless it was going to be Houston. If everybody is satisfied, and the tone of the article definitely does take a positive mindset as to how Arenado is feeling about everything now, and he said all of this when he got here last week, that he's comfortable with St. Louis, he's comfortable being a Cardinal, and he's in the right place with a lot to prove, and is a Cardinal till he's told otherwise. Said all the right things and is now at camp doing all the right things. But with this last piece of information that, the team that we didn't really know who that final team was on the list was in fact the team that John Mozeliak tried to send him to. I mean, you just got to throw your hands up, I think, at that point, if you're John Mozeliak, and say, there is truly nothing else I could have done. This didn't come out publicly until now, and it's reported via Katie's sources. If you're John Mozeliak, I think that deserves to be out there, right? I think it deserves to be out there so that people can know, hey, you may not have enjoyed the fact that I didn't get the thing done that I was trying to get done, and you can pile on and beat me up for it, but what was the guy supposed to do? I don't know what the sentiment's going to be as a response in this podcast. The comments will tell me that, and you guys let me know if I'm off base with this. But do you view this any differently now, knowing that John Mozeliak tried to send Nolan Arenado to one of the places that he was approved to send him, and then the way that the Astros got their payroll situation and roster situation lined up to be able to take Arenado's contract on was the straw that broke the camel's back in causing Arenado to question whether or not the Astros were serious enough about winning for it to be worth it to make that jump. I mean, it's understandable from all sides. It really is. But like I said, I think if anybody has a right or a reason to be the most frustrated with all this, it's John Mozeliak, because he did everything that he was asked to do, He facilitated a deal. It's hard to trade a big name, prominent player like this and to do it under the cover of darkness so the deal doesn't get blown up because stuff gets leaked out and things change and feelings get hurt. To do that is difficult. Just to do it once. To do it twice in like a 2-month span, that is, I mean, you're talking about threading the camel through the eye of a needle. It's nearly impossible, especially given the limited number of teams that he had to work with. So I feel sympathy for Mo on this one, especially now knowing that it was the Astros. I just don't know what else he was supposed to have done. That being said, I think it's a good thing that Nolan Arenado was still a Cardinal because at the end of the day, they didn't do roster-wise a lot of the things that could have truly pushed this toward full-scale rebuild. And by the way, that's on purpose. As I told you all offseason, they still have a desire to win games in 2025. So if that is still a desire that's within them, in theory, Nolan Arenado should help them be able to win some games. Does it mean you're kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit? Does it mean you're half in, half out on some things? Yeah. But I also think a lot of this isn't always black and white, and there are going to be things that happen in the 2025 season that players are going to develop in a way that you didn't expect. Guys are going to regress. Guys are going to be better than you thought they were supposed to be. The Andre Palantes will, emerge, and maybe the Cardinals get enough of those guys that they didn't really give much consideration to, and then they take on a bigger role and they earn it, and suddenly they're part of the present and the future. Maybe enough of those happen that the Cardinals are like, hey, look, we're actually, even on a lower payroll, in a situation where we're closer to winning than we thought. Maybe some of the prospects that you are counting on turn out to be as good as advertised, and they do it maybe a little quicker than expected. Suddenly you've got your midseason reinforcements. It could certainly go the other way, and the Cardinals by June, July could be looking really closely at doing more of a rebuild type of situation, whether it's a short-term version of that or a longer term. That does involve maybe kicking the can again on Arenado and trading maybe some of the other short-term assets like a Fetty, like a Helsley, Jojo Romero, maybe even some other guys. Like all of these things I think are still in play, and that's why I don't feel as compelled to just go so black and white with, well, the Cardinals said they're resetting or the Cardinals said they're transitioning, and I need to, grade every single move that they make through that lens. Yeah, it would be nice to have some consistency and some clarity of direction. I think the Arenado situation was an example of, hey, if we do this, a lot of the other dominoes are going to fall into place in terms of that clarity of direction. And we now know the why behind the deal not coming to fruition. I don't know that it's even a situation where you could say, oh, you blame Mozeliak or you blame Arenado because everybody was adult about this and just had to deal with some of the ramifications of their own actions and their own decisions. Again, like I said, if you're frustrated with the way that this all went down because you just are saying, look, this is just another example of the Cardinal front office not being able to execute in building the roster and moving toward a goal, and this is just a prime example of that, I mean, that's fair, but I just look at it and say, I don't think the Cardinals would have been in a better situation had Arenado been elsewhere. I don't think you were getting a difference-maker prospect in return. I don't think that you were doing anything really other than saving money for ownership. Could there have been a world in which you saved the money if it was $50 million or whatever ends up getting eaten by the team that acquires him, and you use some of that money to pour it back into the roster in other areas because third base wouldn't be a need if Gorman was there and Donovan could play second and the whole trickle down, Burleson, DH, everything kind of work out with guys getting opportunities and guys having spots to show what they could do. Yeah, maybe they would have, but I mean, what's the area that this roster desperately needed a piece? Where are they one guy away from really being able to have this thing cook? Like definitively. It's not the rotation. Could adding a free agent have made the rotation better on paper? 100%. I'm not very confident in knowing exactly what you're going to get from Steven Matz. I'm a little more confident in knowing what you're going to get from Michaelis, and it's not necessarily favorable, right? It could be a guy that, even if you're talking about the favorable potential outcome, it's an ERA in the mid-4s, maybe? Low to mid-4s? So, yeah, there are ways that you could have improved the rotation, but I think with where the Cardinals are at, it's kind of like, all right, let Matz go out there, and if he surprises you, great. If Michaelis surprises you, great. If not, You're giving the Quinn Matthews of the world, the Graceffos of the world, the Tink Hences of the world, maybe that runway that they need the first few months of the season to potentially be knocking at the door at the right time to take over for some veterans if those guys happen to be underperforming. So blocking further some of the prospects that you're excited about, that's whether it's a pitching prospect or a position player. We already know that Arenado has sort of created more of a logjam in terms of getting all of these younger 22 to 26-year-old players the opportunity to determine whether or not they're part of your future. You aren't going to sign a big bat to slot into one of those spots while you're already trying to say, hey, these guys that we have on hand, are they any good? And can we find out about that this year? I think that's where the term transition comes from. The Cardinals are transitioning from where they were to where they're going, and this is kind of the awkward middle ground that you got to be water, you got to stay malleable and flexible to find a way to see through the goals that they have. And I'm not saying it's for sure going to work, but as I look specifically to this Arenado situation, I don't know. I think the fact that it played out the way that they did and that everybody can be, even if they're not thrilled about the process of it, can be comfortable with where they are now, it could end up being for the better. But everybody gets to live with the decision that they made, right? Like if Arenado overplayed his hand and he, wishes that he had been traded and that he hadn't nixed the Houston deal, that's the lesson that's learned. Like he had every opportunity to be somewhere else. It wasn't the Dodgers. Dodgers didn't want him. It wasn't the Yankees. Yankees didn't seem to want him, at least not enough to engage in a meaningful way. The Red Sox, they would have been happy to have him, it sounds like, but they wanted Bregman more to the extent that they paid him way more, $40 million per year. Now, maybe they're counting on him opting out early and not having to owe him the remainder of that deal, but it is what it is, man. Cardinals are in the spot they're in, Arenado's in the spot he's in, and everybody's kind of got to live with the way that they handled everything that went down. That being said, my takeaway is, dude, if Houston was on the list and John Mozeliak tried to trade him there, feel like he probably gets a little bit ripped too hard for the way that all of this went down, especially considering it was the edict of ownership to get payroll into a more manageable situation than it had been before. He's just the conduit of that and the guy that had to try to make the money work, but I don't think John Mozeliak ever wanted his last substantial move running the Cardinals to be trading away Arenado for basically nothing in the form of a salary dump. So I think he stood his ground. Whatever that deal with Houston was going to be reasonable enough. Like I said, I still would wonder, and I'd love to know, what players were the Cardinals potentially going to get in that deal, and would it have been any notable names that you would go, oh, yeah, that really could have helped 2025 and 2026 St. Louis Cardinals beyond just, hey, at least Gorman has somewhere to play and you can find out about him. Beyond that, I don't know that the Cardinals were going to end up gaining a whole lot, and certainly in any other iteration of a deal, it would have been harder to imagine because Houston ended up being willing to eat more of a portion of Arenado's salary than I think anybody else that would have engaged would have been willing to do. Just my take. I think John Mozeliak got a bad rap on this one. And again, you could say, well, he should have done some other things in the offseason once it was clear they couldn't do the Arenado thing. Yeah, maybe. But I don't know the number that ownership gave him as far as, hey, payroll's got to be this. I don't know what that number was. I know what they say publicly, right? When asked at the winter warm-up about potentially having to lower payroll even further if Arenado doesn't end up getting moved, the DeWitts said, oh, no, we don't really think we need to do that. But did they maybe want him to anyway? It didn't happen. None of the other guys with salaries were traded, and there never were really substantial rumors about any of those players. But we don't necessarily know what the number was that was the target for payroll. So if they didn't ever get to that number, that would probably explain why they didn't go out and make other moves to add free agency names to their list. That would have cost US dollars to get him on board, because they might have legitimately had to do the Arenado thing before ownership would have allowed more spending to take place. And that thing never happened. We now know the reasons why, and it sort of is what it is. So let me know, Cardinals fans, what you think about it. Do you feel for Mo? Do you feel like he got a bad rap, a raw deal in this whole thing? Or, yeah, I think I already know the answer to that. But let me know anyway in the comments below. I tried to lay out the situation as I saw it, and, let me know whether you agree with me or disagree with me. It's getting late at night. I've got a very early morning. Have to take my wife and my son back to the airport, kind of far away as well. before getting back to Jupiter for another day of Cardinals camp, which is the first day of Grapefruit League play. So going to be fun on Saturday, but let me know, Cardinals fans, in the comments what you think, and continue supporting the channel. Check out the channel memberships in the video description below, and we will talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.